Thank you, Chair, and thank you all so much for coming before the committee today to contribute to this very timely issue. In particular, thank you to Ms. Dimitrieva for being willing to share your story, and I'd also like to express my sympathies for the suffering. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has brought the realities of Article 11 into very sharp focus. The horrors and challenges of conflict are even more acutely felt by disabled people and their families. In examining this area and in last week's committee on the same topic, we are aware of the significant negative impacts on people with disabilities during not only conflicts, but also humanitarian emergencies and in natural disasters. First, a few questions just to kind of put to everybody. So I think we're all struck by the incredible support for the Ukrainian people by the Irish people, but we're also aware that other refugees, such as Syrians or Afghans, have been more difficult to reach. I'm just wondering if anybody had anything they'd suggest the government could do to help develop a more standardised approach to ensure that people with disabilities or additional needs are supported to reach our country, access international protection and have parity of access to supports and information. Another question is, I'm wondering if anyone wants to explain how other countries are more effectively working with disabled people to develop policies and mechanisms that can best ensure safety in disaster and in conflict situations. And thirdly, the current and growing impacts and risks of climate change have been mentioned in this discussion, more so in last week's committee. But can anyone discuss what proactive approaches can be taken to help best prepare for climate-related events and emergencies? And I think probably what Dr. McDonough was talking about there, about building a human rights-based framework, is crucial. And then specifically for Adam Harris, you mentioned that it's highly probable that there'll be many undiagnosed autistic adults arriving in Ireland, particularly women. Can you discuss this further in terms of the urgent measures that need to be implemented to identify these individuals and ensure they get the care they need? And a question for Dr. McDonough. You noted issues that may arise in refugees seeking disability services. And given the current state of services, especially for children, but for everybody, I think we'd all be concerned that this may take years, if we're being realistic, and even getting in the door is a challenge. So what proactive measures should the HSE be taking now to provide information to refugees? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So we'll start with Walk. With Catherine, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll take the one on access for people with disabilities coming in. And I suppose what we're experiencing is basically that people are coming in, and when you need to find out where you get certain information, you're ringing people, but everyone is reacting to it and they're not sure where the information is, how someone accesses it. In terms of social welfare, I think that's been very clear when they go to the airport, but it is it's things like access to getting signed up with a GP. It is, access to the physical care that people need, and it's access to accommodation specifically for people with disabilities. That's where all the blocks are, and there isn't one place to go for a coordinated response on this. So if we were to, and we've been asked several times to go back to Lublin and bring other families over, but if we bring them over, when we arrive with them, we're left with the same problem that we have. Where are they to be housed? And we can support around people's medical needs or access and all of that, but we have no accommodation for anyone arriving over. And that comes to a moral issue. You're bringing them over to go into a system that is going to further re-traumatise them. And if we knew, for example, that people could be brought over, and Adam has spoken and Minister Rabbit spoke about a lot of people with disabilities being in camps in Moldova where they are not able to cope with them, and the human response is to actually go and bring people over, and we're not proactively bringing people with disabilities over, or we've no coordinated response. We know people are in institutions. We know they're dying in institutions, and there isn't a European response to go and get them individuals out of the institutions. And across Europe, agree how many are going into how many countries and exactly what we are going to do for them. That doesn't exist.
Okay. Adam?
Thank you, Chair. I think to the first point, I suppose people fleeing from countries other than Ukraine, I think what it really comes down to is a much better education around Article 11, and I think linking to that, it's about, to Rosaline's point, this isn't about us doing something that's kind or nice. It's about our obligations as a state party to an international treaty. So I think that's the most important thing. I think when we spoke about inaccessible accommodation there recently, and the reality is direct provision centres are anything but accessible or inclusive for autistic people. And as long as people are staying there, we are deeply failing in that regard. What I do think, though, to your points about climate change and preparing for major emergencies more generally, I think at the core of this is actually really to do with changing our culture around how we think about disability, because I think, if we think about another major emergency, which was the point I was trying to make earlier, COVID-19, what was glaringly clear is autistic people, disabled people were not prioritised often enough during the COVID-19 pandemic, whether that was in relation to schooling, whether that was in relation to supports that were absolutely vital for people being kind of treated as if they were discretionary. So I think what's really needed is a standing major emergency response that plans for emergencies with a disability lens, not when we're in the middle of an emergency and we're dealing with it generally, we think about disability briefly. We need to be proactively planning for possible emergencies that arise through a disability lens in advance. I think that's really important. I think just in relation to the issue of adults and what we can do, I think it links to Catherine's point about, not re-traumatising people, because there is a piece that on the one hand, absolutely we want to get people to safe harbour, but also often when you're talking to people before they make the journey to Ireland, you're in a very difficult situation, because on the one hand you want to say you'll be so welcome, the Irish people are really supportive, but on the other hand, we have terrible autism services, we have terrible disability services too often, and that's a reality. So what I do believe is one of the sorts of steps we can take to address this urgently, particularly if we think about autistic women who may be arriving undiagnosed, often women will present for diagnosis after a major life event, I suppose, that's raised questions. And I can only imagine fleeing your country in a time of war is an example of that. But really what we have to look at here is how we're training our mental health teams and also public routes to diagnosis. So I think it's an example of where the new autism innovation strategy, we should be thinking about Ukraine proactively as part of that process. But I think also we need to be actually solving the fundamental issues of access to mental health care and training in order to address this specific issue as well.
Okay. Rosaline?
Thank you, Deputy Kearns, for highlighting how important the human rights framework is to our response. I suppose for me it would be a person-centered response. So when people are being assessed at the airport, that there is, I know the HSC has a question on impairment disability, but sometimes for all sorts of reasons, trauma included, some disabled people and their family, their mothers, won't identify or won't say it because they feel nobody will take them or they won't be housed. So there's a bit about being cognizant of identifiers and indicators. There's also a process where your GP should be able to put almost like a triage, that there would be a triage for children who are deemed to have an impairment or disability would be assessed for mental health, speech and language, physiotherapy, and other needs. Also, I want to add, and again, I understand what I'm about to say will not be favoured, but I will caution strongly against putting people into institutions here in Ireland. If we have learned anything from they don't offer individual attention which all children need, and they also become warehouses. So I would be cautioned, but I understand we have a housing crisis, and it's very difficult to manage a humanitarian crisis when both crises are clashing against one another and there's tension. However, I really would be mindful and be really aware of the dangers of putting people in large institutions or congregated settings. I will also respond to Deputy Kearns by saying, again, it's another arm of human rights, but that is around safeguarding. Our system of assessment in disability areas is not equality proofed. It's not risk adverse proof. And I just be very aware of pitfalls and the vulnerability of children and mothers around language, but also around being able to say no, or being able to say if something bad happened to them, either in Ukraine, but also here in Ireland, it's very hard for anyone to bite the hand that feeds you. So it's up to us as a state to have all those, sorry, my language is leaving me, all those set of principles and values in place that if we're going to do a humanitarian response, please do it right and learn from other models outside of our jurisdiction. And also, I suppose, going back to the child-centered or person-centered in the context of deaf and disabled children and adults, you know, not every Ukrainian person, child or mother, will have the same needs. So it's about being flexible. It's also about being aware of diversity. And it's also sort of giving people time to draw their breath, you know, and just hurrying people into services here, there, and everywhere. And just, we work at a pace where people are able to manage. Thank you, Deputy.
Thanks very much. Thank you.